What's up guys? Today I thought we'd look at racetracks. Two racetracks in particular, starting with this one though, Barcelona. Why on earth does the whole of Formula One pick up everything from their European factories and decamp to Barcelona in the cold of the winter to pound round for the only 8 days of pre-season testing that we ever get each year? The other one is this. You may have seen this yesterday being announced by Formula E. I told you there was a big announcement coming last week in Formula E for UK Formula E fans, and this was it, a London E-Prix back next season, 2020. It'll be the final 2 races of the season. It'll be a double header on the final weekend in July. And personally, I think it's epic. I love it. It's going to be around the Excel Centre in East London, the Royal Docks, Royal Victoria Docks. And look, this is the circuit. I want to know what you think of this, because this is unique because of its location. It's obviously on the outskirts of the edge of the east end of London, but crucially, this is the first time a racetrack will go both outdoors and indoors. Part of the circuit will go through the inside of the ExCeL Exhibition Centre. Now, I know that's unconventional, and I know that die-hard Formula One fans will look at that and go, that's ridiculous. What a joke. This is some sort of gimmick. This is not a kart track, this is a racing track. All right, fair play, but this is not a Formula One track, this is a Formula E track, and that is where the big difference comes. You have to look at this, not with your Formula One eyes, but look at this with Formula E eyes. What could they do with a track that part of it goes through the inside of an exhibition hall? What could they do with that? What could they do with lighting? Could it be partly a night, almost like a night race through that sector? Be pitch black with clever, dramatic, kind of spectacular lighting, with fans right up on top of the circuit. There's no issues with massive noise pollution. There's no issues with pollution from combustion gases. You couldn't do this in Formula One, but you can do it in Formula E. And that's why I love the fact that they've done it. They're doing something a little bit different. What if it's raining outside, but dry inside? What sort of a challenge could that present to the drivers and the teams? I think the possibilities for this are absolutely spectacular. It looks like a decent circuit as well. I think as a fan experience, if you're inside that exhibition centre overlooking the track as you could possibly be, I think this could be pretty cool. I think it could be a pretty cool experience, a pretty cool event. The fact that FE is coming back to London for me is brilliant. I was at the very first races in Battersea Park, and although the circuit there was very narrow, incredibly narrow and difficult to pass on, I actually thought the event went down pretty well. So I'm really pleased to see it come back home, I guess, for Formula E, and I'd love to know your thoughts on this particular circuit. So why do we go to Barcelona every single year? This year it was actually fine, wasn't it? The weather was good, the teams got loads and loads of running done, the temperatures were relatively high. But think about last year. Last year it was snowing, we had days called off and massively limited running because of the temperature and the weather conditions. And year on year we seem to have that kind of trouble where everyone asks the question, why do we go to Barcelona? Well, there's a number of reasons. We used to go to Kyalami, way back. We used to go to Kyalami in South Africa where the temperature was guaranteed to be hot, and we'd do it kind of on the way to Australia for the first race. As part of the cost reduction of Formula One over the years, we now have come back to Europe. So that takes away the option of things like Kyalami and those kind of places. We've been to Bahrain in the past. Again, guaranteed weather. I spent nearly 2 weeks in Bahrain a few years ago for pre-season testing, where I was away from home for 2 weeks. We did a week of testing. We stayed out over the course of the long weekend in between tests. We rebuilt the car. We even painted the car, as far as I recall, in one of the garages at the Bahrain circuit. And it was great. We got loads of running done. It was representative running as well, because the tyres and everything was at temperatures more like the temperatures we're going to experience over the course of the season. Now though, we come back into Europe, mostly because of the cost of getting everything, flying everything out to a long haul test. The cost involved in packaging everything up, putting into the freight containers that we then send on to Australia, to do that just 2 weeks earlier for a test is a huge logistical challenge and a massive cost implication. Barcelona is a great circuit, it's a great location because of its proximity to most people's factories. And when I say that, I'm talking about the fact that pretty much every single day of the 2-week test that we've just had, every night there will have been vans turning up by road from every team's factory, rocking up to the circuit every single day, and the team will unpack boxes and boxes and boxes of new stuff. That's the rate of development that's going on in every single team. It's the rate of production. We saw teams like Williams were late getting to that test because their production was so late. Now, the perfect Formula One scenario is that you get your car finished literally the day of the launch. So you can roll it out, have the pictures taken, and then you roll it into the truck and send it off to the first test in Barcelona. But that's only half the story, because then you've got no spares. So constantly there's spares being produced, being manufactured, being stuck into boxes and vans and then shipped out to the racetrack, where every single night the team will receive them. Lots of those new components, development components, will go onto a car. Lots of components will just get cycled through to start developing mileage onto each one of those. As parts come off the car each evening to be kind of proof checked and crack checked and that kind of thing, if you've got a set of spares to go on in its place, you don't have to wait for that proof checking and crack checking to be done. So the fact that we're close to the team's factories in Barcelona is actually a massive advantage, not to be underestimated when we're all sitting at home just watching the cars go around on track. The workload that's going on in the background each evening is astronomical. And because testing is testing, and the point of testing is to try new components, and because the rate of development is so great back in the factory, some of those new components will only be ready in the early hours of the day before you go testing, or midway through a test. And so if we were in Bahrain and we had to get those boxed up, sent out to Heathrow, then stuck on an aeroplane and shipped and flown out to Bahrain or wherever, you can lose an extra day or 2 days just in terms of travel. The same in getting components back to the factory that need servicing, or if things need repainting, things need getting back to the factory to be ready to be packed up and sent off to Australia right now. That's what's happening today as we speak. In terms of the racetrack itself, well, let's have a little look at it. Woohoo! Okay, not a great example, but the circuit itself is actually a decent mix of corners. We've got Sector 1 and Sector 2 that are fast, that are flowing, have very fast corners that really test the aerodynamic performance of every single race car. But then we've got Sector 3, which is really tight and twisty and much more slow corners, much more demand on the mechanical and the high aerodynamic efficiency of these cars. So it's a nice balanced mix. You know, this is a circuit which is very difficult to set the car up for the entire lap. We actually go there with pretty much maximum downforce, even though the first 2 sectors are really high speed, and actually it's a big compromise. So in terms of testing, we can actually test different parts of the car at different parts of the lap. We can set the car up for the first 2 sectors if we want to test the sort of lower downforce, the higher speed, maximum velocity attributes of our car, and then we can do different tests focused more on the 3rd and final sector in Barcelona, which is this slower, tighter, twistier, maximum downforce. So we can do a lot of different things at Barcelona that perhaps we can't do at some other circuits. The last sector is very much representative of things like places like Monaco, places like Singapore even perhaps. Whereas the first 2 sectors are much more perhaps like places like Silverstone, Suzuka, really high speed. Really flat out down this first long straight, and it is a very, very long straight with a really heavy braking zone just here at the end. Hard on the brakes, turning in, clipping the curb, trying to minimise the understeer through there. I've cut that chicane slightly. And then flat out up through turn 3, which is a really, really demanding circuit on the car. Heavy on the brakes again, quite a demanding circuit when it comes to braking. Well, you've really got to lean on the car through some of these corners, trusting that the aerodynamics are going to give you the grip that it actually feels like it should never have. But because we're running maximum downforce, the faster we go through those sections, actually the more grip we have. This is a tricky corner. massively on the brakes from really high speeds, trying desperately not to get understeer through that corner, clipping the curb, a bit too much there, through that one, and then waiting patiently before getting back on the power and into this final sector, which is really frustratingly slow, really difficult. As a driver, this is completely different to what you've been used to from the rest of the lap. And then we start it all again. One of the trickiest things about Barcelona is actually keeping your tyres alive for the entire lap. Because the first two sections are so fast and you're relying on the grip so much through the very fast corners, leaning on the outside tyres so much, by the time you get to the last part of the lap where you really need maximum grip from those tyres, it's very easy to overcook them, overwork them, and have them give up by the time you need them most towards the end of the lap. So you've really got to be careful about how you use the tyres over the course of the entire lap. It's not a case of just going flat out, which is what a driver absolutely wants to do. Because of the fact that the lap is in very distinct different sectors. The first two sectors, as I said, being flat out, fast, high speed, leaning on the tyres so much, it's very easy for them to give up by the end of the lap. When I talk about the tyres giving up by the end of the lap, what I'm talking about is you leaning on them, putting so much demand on them for the first 2/3 of the lap, that by the time you get towards the end of the lap where they are really under stress because of so many quick changes of direction, so many tight and twisty corners, they're overheating, the surface temperature is overheating. And because the ambient temperature, particularly this year, as we've seen for a couple of cars, Mercedes notably talked about this, because the ambient temperature is perhaps lower than we might see at places like Monaco, like Singapore, some of the other tracks that we'll go to later in the year that have that tight and twisty final sector. Because the ambient temperature is so low, when you're going through that final sector, having already worked the tyres hard, it's very easy to overheat the surface layer of the rubber on the tyre, and that's when you introduce graining. And that's what we heard Mercedes talking about so much, didn't we? Where we overheat the tread surface compared to the temperature of the core bulk of the tyre, and that top surface, just the tiny little top bits of the rubber itself, start to roll off the tyre. A little bit like when you drag a pencil eraser. Oh, for fuck's sake. We just had a power cut. The power has just gone off from the entire house. Lights have gone out. Xbox has gone off. Well, look, you can still see me. That's hilarious. The top surface of the rubber on the tyre, because it gets superheated through the massive amounts of frictional forces through the final sector, having already been worked hard, because that surface temperature gets raised up so abruptly and so high compared to the bulk of the tyre, you can start to shear off the top layer. And as I was saying, when you drag a pencil eraser, a rubber, across your desk at school, remember those days? And little bits of it start to rub off, don't they? Start to peel off, leaving behind a sort of trail of tiny little fragments of rubber. That's exactly what happens on a hot Formula One tyre. That's what graining is. That's what Mercedes experienced. And that, when that was on, is kind of why, because of that last sector of the circuit combined with the lower ambient temperatures than we might normally see. And that is one of the problems with going to Barcelona. I've talked about some of the great things about Barcelona, about its proximity, about the different, elements within the circuit layout. But because of the temperature, the ambient temperature in general at this time of year across Europe, that does provide a little bit of a problem. So how much can teams really learn about the performance of the tyres given that the ambient temperature and the track temperature therefore is so much lower? Well, what they tend to do is they tend to use the data they have collected over those 2 weeks of testing. And as I said, this year wasn't quite so bad, but they will use that as a baseline set of data, and then from that they will start to amend figures. They'll start to be able to extract from that data the predictions of what they think will happen as the ambient and track temperatures start to rise at some of the other circuits. So they can still... There we go. There we go. The dogs are barking because when the power comes back on, the doorbell rings. They'll settle down in a minute. Oh my God, it's all happening. It's all happening. So look, Barcelona has pros and cons to it. The cost is definitely a pro because it's so much cheaper to be able to do that and to be able to ferry the components back and forth, to have a link to your factory that's, you know, actually tangibly usable every single day. Travelling to and from Barcelona back to the UK or back to mainland Europe, where some of the other factories are, is absolutely doable. It takes, you know, hours in, you know, by road in a van. So that's absolutely achievable and makes a huge difference to the team's preparation. It also means post-test. So when the test finishes, the same thing applies. We can get everything back from the circuit and back to the factory much quicker. And therefore we can get on with the servicing, the turning things around, the making things ready for Australia before everything has to pack up again. I talked in yesterday's video about there being 2 weeks between the end of the test and the first race in Melbourne. For the team's perspective, there's just a few days between getting things back from Barcelona and having to send the freight off to Australia. So 2 weeks to us is nothing to the teams because it boils down to a handful of days. So the quicker you can get things back from the test, the better the preparations will be. So whilst Barcelona has loads of pros, loads of things going for it, and of course don't forget we've been going there for years, so the teams have an immense understanding of that circuit, huge amounts of historical data. The engineers and the drivers are so experienced around that track, having done so many laps. I mean, when I was on the test team at McLaren, I spent half my life at Barcelona, it felt like. So there's all of that going for it, which means you have a great understanding of how to generate a good balance of a car. And you need a good balance on a car to then be able to test all the items you want to test. The run plan on a Formula One test relies on having good basic balance. And Barcelona is a great easy circuit to do that because we know it so well. But where else can we go? Well, one of the great places that is great for testing is Paul Ricard. Right down the south of France, generally temperatures perhaps a little bit higher, but generally decent. But also that circuit, whilst maybe not a great Grand Prix circuit, if we're all honest, is a fantastic test facility. It has a completely evolving circuit that you can change the configuration into so many different options around that track, and that means that potentially you could run a different configuration on the first week to the second week so that teams can experience different types of corner loadings and different types of aerodynamic performance over the course of their 8 days. You've got almost endless possibilities in terms of doing that. There's also massive amounts of runoff areas, so very, very unlikely you're going to damage a car at Paul Ricard, which is absolutely the worst thing you can do in pre-season testing. So places like that have a lot going for it. It's got a sprinkler system. If you want to do wet tyre testing, you can very easily do that at the flick of a switch at Paul Ricard. So that's a great option. That's one of those places that lots of people talk about, you know, maybe we should go there. And I can see us doing that. I can see us moving to that in that sort of direction at some point. But right now, with the cost implications of going further afield, with the proximity of the circuits to the factories, as I said, Barcelona is not a bad place to conduct our very limited 8 days of testing. And hopefully the teams have made the most of that over the last couple of weeks. But we've only got to wait, what, a few more days? Maybe, what is it now, 10 days or so, until we find out.